You know, every single day we're all buying things. A coffee, a new phone, maybe groceries for the week. It feels so simple, right? But underneath that quick tap to pay is this whole complex legal world. So today, we're going to pull back that curtain on the contract of sale and see what's really going on, legally speaking, every time you buy something.
So let's picture this. You're scrolling online, you find the perfect thing, you click that big, beautiful Buy Now button. And a few days later, bam, it's at your door. But what did that click actually do? I mean, was it a promise, a digital handshake, or did you just become the legal owner of that thing right in that split second? That's the big question we're diving into today.
Okay, so to really get what that click means, we have to start with the foundation. We need to understand the legal blueprint for pretty much every purchase you'll ever make. And it all starts with something called a contract of sale.
Now, this definition comes right out of the law books, and trust me, the wording here is super precise. The key phrase to zero in on is that the seller transfers or agrees to transfer the ownership. We're not just talking about the physical item itself, and it has to be in exchange for a price.
Right, so that one legal term, contract of sale, it's kind of like an umbrella. It covers two different situations. First, when ownership changes hands right there on the spot, that's called a sale. And second, when ownership will change hands sometime down the road, that's an agreement to sell. And you're about to see why this little distinction is actually a huge deal.
So what does it actually take to make one of these contracts happen? Well, think of it like a recipe. To have a valid sale, you need 4 essential ingredients. And if you're missing even one of them, the whole thing just doesn't work.
First up, you need 2 separate parties, a buyer and a seller. Pretty straightforward. You can't really sell something to yourself. Second, the thing being sold has to be goods, which basically means movable property. So this doesn't apply to your house. Third, and this one is so important, ownership has to be transferred. You know, just borrowing your friend's car isn't a sale. And finally, there has to be a price. We're talking about money. If there's no money changing hands, it's just a barter or a gift, not a legal sale.
All right, it's time for our first big showdown. We've said that a sale and an agreement to sell are different. But how different are they really? Let me tell you, the consequences are massive.
So here's the bottom line, the simplest way to think about it. A sale is what's called an executed contract. It's done, finished. Ownership has passed to you, the buyer, right now. But an agreement to sell is executory. It's a promise that ownership will pass in the future, maybe when you pay the last installment or when the item is delivered.
Let's make this real. Imagine you find the scooter of your dreams. You sign the papers, you agree to pay for it. The seller says, "Great, we'll deliver it in 10 days." Now, in that moment, before it's even in your driveway, do you actually own it? The answer to that question decides who's on the hook if something awful happens to it in those 10 days.
And here is exactly why this matters so much. There's a golden rule in commercial law that says risk follows ownership. All that means is whoever is the legal owner of the item when it gets lost, damaged, or destroyed, they're the one who has to bear the loss. It has nothing to do with who's physically holding it. It's all about who holds the legal title.
This table really breaks it all down. In a sale, boom, ownership and risk pass to you, the buyer, immediately. You get a special right called jus in rem, which is a fancy way of saying you have a right against the whole world to that specific thing. It is yours. But in an agreement to sell, the risk stays with the seller, and your right is jus in personam. It's a personal right just against that one seller to make them keep their promise. This changes everything, from what happens if someone breaks the deal to what happens if one of you goes bankrupt. The differences are just huge.
Okay, time for our second showdown. And this is one that honestly trips up a ton of people. The difference between a sale and a hire purchase. I mean, they can look really similar, especially when you're paying in installments, but legally, they are completely different animals.
If you remember one thing, remember this. In a sale, even one where you pay over time, you are legally obligated to finish the purchase. You have to pay the full price. But in a hire purchase agreement, you're really just renting the item. You have the option to buy it at the very end. That one word, option, changes everything.
And that one little difference creates a massive domino effect. In a hire purchase, you don't own that thing until you've made the very last payment. Until then, you're just a bailee or a hirer, basically a renter. This means you can decide to terminate the agreement and just give the item back. And, this is a big one, since you're not the owner, you have absolutely no legal right to sell that item to somebody else.
So, we've talked a lot about the contracts themselves, but what about the actual stuff being sold? It turns out the law has a very specific way of classifying goods, and that classification can actually change how they're allowed to be sold.
Believe it or not, the law gets super specific about what counts as goods.
It all boils down to a pretty simple family tree. At the very top, goods are split into 3 main branches. We've got existing goods, future goods, and contingent goods.
So, existing goods are just what they sound like, things the seller already owns or has in their possession. They can be specific, like that specific vintage watch in the display case. They can be unascertained, like you just order 50 chairs, any 50 chairs, from a giant warehouse. And ascertained goods? That's just a fancy term for those unascertained goods after someone is gone and picked out the specific 50 chairs for you.
Next up, we have future goods. These are things that either don't exist yet or that the seller doesn't own yet when the contract is made. The classic example is agreeing to buy a farmer's entire wheat harvest for next year's season. A deal for future goods can only ever be an agreement to sell, right? Because ownership can't possibly transfer right now for something that doesn't exist.
And finally, we get to the most interesting one, I think. Contingent goods. These are a special type of future good, but their existence depends entirely on an event that might not even happen. For instance, I agreed to sell you a rare painting, but only if I can successfully buy it at an auction next week. The entire sale is contingent. It hangs on that big if.
So you see, from a simple click online to a huge business deal, the type of contract you make is a really big deal. It decides who owns what, who carries the risk, and what your rights actually are. So the next time you buy something, think about it. Are you making a sale, an agreement to sell, or maybe a hire purchase? Because knowing the difference, that's the key to knowing what you're really signing up for.